My mom left me with only $2. A little alien girl asked a human to be her dad. Ethan sat on the curb, staring at the two crumpled bills in his hand. His fingers rubbed over the paper as though it might somehow transform into something more. It didn't. Only $2. He glanced up at the city skyline, tall buildings looming overhead, casting long shadows over the forgotten corners of the streets. This was not the life he had imagined for himself. He had never asked for any of this. Just a few weeks ago, his life had been different. He had been at home, sitting at the kitchen table, his mother's gentle voice filling the room as she spoke of her research, of her passion for uncovering the mysteries of the universe. But now his mother was gone, disappeared without a trace. No answers, no explanations. Just a note left on the kitchen counter, a promise to return that never came true. Ethan had tried to hold on to the hope that she would come back, but deep down, he knew it was futile. The authorities had promised they were looking for her, but he had seen the way they looked at him when they came to his school, asking the same questions over and over. They didn't care about a missing scientist. To them, he was just another orphan, another statistic. With his mother gone, Ethan had nowhere to go. The social workers hadn't been much help. No relatives, no family friends who could take him in. He had been bounced from one cold, unfamiliar place to the next, never staying long enough to make any real connections. The only thing he had left was the streets. He spent his days scavenging for food, looking for odd jobs wherever he could find them. The city was full of people, but he had never felt more alone. No one seemed to notice him. No one cared. He didn't matter. On this particular evening, as the last light of day slipped behind the horizon, Ethan was walking through the park, trying to make sense of his future. The wind had picked up, biting at his skin as he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. The park, once full of children and families, now lay empty, its swings swaying in the breeze. Ethan was about to turn around when something caught his eye. It was a faint glow, flickering in the distance, coming from behind a large tree. At first he thought it might be a streetlight malfunctioning, but then he noticed something else, movement. Soft, quiet, almost imperceptible. Curiosity tugged at him. He shouldn't go toward it. It could be anyone, someone dangerous, or just another person in need. But something inside him made him walk closer, cautiously, step by step. As he rounded the tree, he froze. There in the clearing stood a small figure, a girl, no older than 7 or 8, with skin that shimmered in the dim light. She was looking at him with wide, unblinking eyes. They were the most unusual eyes he had ever seen, large and luminous, like two pools of liquid silver. Her hair was a strange shade of blue, and her clothes seemed out of place, not like anything he had ever seen before. They were torn as though she had been through something harsh, something beyond what a normal child could endure. Ethan blinked, unsure if he was seeing things. Could she be real? She looked so different, like something out of a dream. The girl took a step forward, her bare feet silent on the grass. Are you a human?" she asked in a voice that was soft, almost musical. Her words were clear, despite the slight accent, and her gaze never wavered from his. Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice shaky. "Yeah, I am, but who are you?" "I am Zora," she said, smiling with a mixture of innocence and something deeper, something Ethan couldn't quite place. I'm looking for someone." Ethan frowned. "Who?" "My family," she said quietly. "I lost them. I don't know where they went." Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her ground, her eyes locked onto his. "Can you help me?" Ethan felt a rush of sympathy flood through him. She looked so lost, so vulnerable, standing there in the dark, so far from any kind of safety or warmth. And yet, there was something strangely familiar about her, something that made him feel an odd connection, even though he had never seen her before. "I don't know if I can help you," he said softly. "I'm kind of on my own, too." Zora's eyes widened slightly, her expression shifting as if she was processing his words. Then she nodded, a serious look on her face. "I understand, but maybe you can still help me." "How?" Ethan asked, confused. "How can I help you?" Zora stepped closer, her small form barely noticeable against the dark backdrop of the trees. "I need a family, I don't have one anymore. And I don't know where to go, can you be my dad?" Ethan was caught off guard by the question. His heart skipped a beat. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was immense. He had never been a father, had never even thought about being one. His mother had always taken care of him. She had always been the one who made decisions, who knew what to do. And now he was being asked to take on something that seemed impossible. I don't know if I can do that," he said, his voice faltering. "I'm not even sure I can take care of myself." But Zora didn't look away. She kept staring at him with those intense, silver eyes, as if she had already made up her mind about something that he wasn't yet sure about. "I think you can. I think you're the only one who can help me." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to process everything. He had just met this strange, otherworldly girl, and already she was asking him to take on a responsibility he had never imagined. He wasn't sure what it meant or why she was asking him, but somehow he knew that this was not just some chance encounter. This was something bigger than both of them. With a heavy sigh, he nodded. "Okay, I'll help you. I'll try." Zora's face lit up with a bright, childlike smile that made Ethan's heart ache. She stepped forward, wrapping her tiny arms around his waist in a hug. Ethan stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do, but he found himself patting her back awkwardly. "We'll figure it out," he whispered, not entirely sure what it was. But he knew one thing, something had just changed, and no matter what came next, he would protect her. He had to. The night had grown darker, the city lights flickering in the distance. Together, the two of them stood in the park, with the weight of the future pressing down on them. But in that moment, Ethan didn't feel so alone anymore. He had a purpose. He had someone to care for. And maybe, just maybe, Zora had found a family. Ethan woke up to the sound of soft footsteps on the pavement. He blinked, trying to adjust his eyes to the morning light. The sky outside the small abandoned building was a pale blue, the kind of quiet morning that made the whole world seem still and peaceful. But inside, things were far from peaceful. There was a weight pressing down on Ethan's chest, something heavy he couldn't ignore. He glanced over at Zora, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor, fiddling with a small, strange-looking device. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, sleek and silver, with buttons and lights that blinked in patterns he couldn't understand. Zora had found it the day before while they were searching for food in an old storage shed. She hadn't said much about it, but Ethan knew it meant something important. She was still trying to figure it out, and so was he. "Hey," Ethan called softly, rubbing his eyes as he stood up. "You all right?" Zora looked up at him with a small smile, her wide silver eyes sparkling. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Her voice was light, but there was something deeper beneath her words, a kind of sadness that she wasn't letting show. It wasn't the first time Ethan had noticed it, and it worried him. This little girl who had already been through so much still had a lot to carry. He could tell. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, his voice firm. He had learned quickly that nothing in this city was ever easy. They couldn't stay in one place too long. Too many people were starting to notice them, and Ethan didn't want to take any chances. Zora nodded, her expression becoming serious. "I know, we'll go to the market. Maybe we can find something to eat." Ethan sighed. They had already visited the market the day before, but it was a risky place for them. The more people they interacted with, the more likely someone would remember them, especially Zara with her unique appearance. But they had little choice. The streets were growing colder and their supplies were running low. They needed food. The two of them gathered their few belongings, a worn-out backpack, some blankets, and the strange device Zora had found. As they made their way toward the door, Ethan felt the familiar tension in his gut, the feeling that they were being watched. He couldn't shake it. There was always someone out there, someone who might have noticed them, someone who could be a threat. As they stepped outside, Ethan glanced around. The city was alive with activity. People bustled along the streets, going about their daily routines. He kept his eyes on the ground, trying to blend in, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. Something was wrong. Zora, walking beside him, seemed oblivious to the danger. She was still too innocent, too trusting, but Ethan couldn't blame her. She was just a child, and she had already been through so much. She had lost everything: her family, her home, her entire world. Now all she had was him, and Ethan didn't know how long he could protect her from what was coming. As they approached the market, Ethan saw a familiar face. A man in a faded blue jacket was standing near a fruit stand, leaning against the wooden post with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He looked like someone who had seen too much of the world's darker side, and Ethan knew him well. His name was Michael. He wasn't exactly a friend, but they had crossed paths more than once in the past. Michael ran odd jobs for people, some of them shady, others just unusual. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. If Michael saw them, things could get complicated fast. Michael wasn't someone you wanted to owe favors to, and he had a way of making people disappear if they weren't careful. He tried to keep his distance, but Zara, in her usual curiosity, pulled ahead, drawn to a small cart with colorful scarves hanging from it. She stopped, her eyes wide with wonder, fascinated by the bright colors. "Zora, come on," Ethan called, trying to keep his voice low. "Let's just go." But it was too late. Michael had spotted them. He straightened up and began walking toward them, his eyes narrowing as he took in Zora's odd appearance. "Well, well," Michael said, his voice low and gravelly. "Look who it is. You know, I didn't expect to see you around here, kid." Ethan tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for Zora's arm. "What do you want, Michael?" Michael took a long drag from his cigarette before flicking it to the ground. "Nothing, really. Just didn't expect to see you with that," he said, motioning toward Zora with a nod of his head. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it that made Ethan's blood run cold. Michael wasn't a man to be trusted. Zora, oblivious to the tension between them, looked up at Michael with a bright smile. "Hi. I like your scarf," she said innocently, pointing to the brightly colored fabric on display. Michael paused, his eyes flicking from Zora to Ethan, then back again. His expression softened for a moment, but only for a second. "Cute," he muttered under his breath. Then he leaned in closer to Ethan, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You know, there are people looking for her. I'm guessing you don't want anyone finding out you're harboring an alien." Ethan's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "You think you're the only one who knows about her. You think you're the only one who's noticed the strange girl in the middle of the city. She's not exactly normal." Ethan could feel his pulse racing. His eyes darted around nervously, but he knew Michael was right. They couldn't keep hiding forever. "Who's looking for her?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Michael shrugged, taking another drag from his cigarette. "I don't know all the details, but let's just say some people have deep pockets and a lot of resources. They'll find her eventually, and when they do, you won't be able to protect her anymore." Ethan's stomach churned. He couldn't let that happen. He had to protect Zora. He didn't care what it took. She was the only family he had now. Michael watched him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Just be careful, kid. If you need help, you know where to find me." Ethan barely nodded, his mind racing. He grabbed Zora's hand, pulling her toward the exit of the market. "Come on," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to go." As they made their way through the crowd, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. He had always known they couldn't stay hidden forever, but now it felt too real, too close. Whoever was looking for Zora, they wouldn't stop until they found her. And that meant Ethan had to act fast. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Ever since Michael's warning, every passing car, every shadow seemed to hide something more sinister. The streets of the city were no longer just a place to survive. They were becoming a maze, and Ethan felt like he was losing his way. Every time he looked at Zara, her trusting eyes filled with innocence and hope, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. They needed to leave the city. It wasn't safe anymore. The authorities were probably looking for them, and if they weren't already, they would be soon. And then there was Michael. Ethan didn't know what to make of his warning. The man had said there were people looking for Zara, people with deep pockets and resources. But who were they? What did they want with a little girl who barely understood her own powers? It was late afternoon when they finally decided to leave. Zara was quieter than usual, her fingers nervously twirling a piece of thread she had found on the ground. She had a tendency to do that when she was thinking or upset. Ethan didn't ask her about it. He didn't want to burden her with his own worries. "Are you sure you're ready?" he asked, trying to sound reassuring. Zora nodded, her silver eyes glimmering in the soft light. "I'm ready. Let's go." The two of them made their way through the back alleys, avoiding the busy main roads where people were more likely to notice them. The farther they got from the city, the more Ethan felt like they were escaping something. But it wasn't just the city they were running from. It was everything: his past, Zora's past, and the future that seemed uncertain at best. They reached the outskirts of the city by dusk. The old industrial zone was a forgotten place, full of rusted buildings and cracked pavement. It was the perfect place to hide for a while. Ethan knew it wouldn't be safe forever, but it would give them some time to think, to figure out what to do next. The place was quiet. No one had been here for years, except for the occasional homeless person or group of scavengers looking for something useful. It was deserted, and that was exactly what they needed. They found an old, abandoned warehouse with a broken door that creaked as Ethan pushed it open. Inside, the space was dark and smelled of dust and mildew. Zora wrinkled her nose but followed Ethan inside without hesitation. "This will work," Ethan said, trying to make the best of the situation. He set down their things and looked around, trying to get a feel for the place. It was cold, but not too bad. They could manage. Zora sat down on an old wooden crate, her eyes still scanning the shadows. "It's not home," she said softly, "but it's safe, right?" Ethan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, it's safe for now." They spent the rest of the evening settling in, using whatever they could find to make the place more comfortable. Ethan pulled out the blanket they had brought with them and spread it across the floor, hoping to make it look less like a cold, empty warehouse. He found a couple of cans of food in the corner, some old tin plates, and heated them over a makeshift stove. They ate in silence, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. Zara, despite her quietness, seemed at ease. She was adjusting to the situation better than Ethan had expected. She wasn't used to being on the run, and yet she had accepted it quickly. She was learning, faster than he could have imagined. When they finished eating, Zora put the empty can down and looked at Ethan. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Where do we go?" Ethan stared at the fire for a long moment. He didn't have an answer. He didn't know where they could go that would be safe, that wouldn't eventually lead someone to find them. The idea of running forever didn't sit well with him, but he also couldn't go back to the city. They were too exposed now. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I'll figure it out. We'll figure it out." Zora didn't say anything more. She simply nodded and pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them. Ethan couldn't help but notice the sadness in her eyes. She was still just a little girl, no matter what secrets she held inside her. And that's what scared him the most. He didn't know if he could protect her. What if the people who were looking for her found them before they could escape? What if he wasn't strong enough to keep her safe? The sound of footsteps outside snapped him out of his thoughts. He tensed, holding his breath, listening. Zara, too, heard them. She stood up immediately, her body tense. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan motioned for her to stay quiet, pressing a finger to his lips. He stood and slowly moved toward the broken window. Through the cracks in the glass, he could see two dark figures standing near the entrance of the warehouse, their silhouettes outlined against the dim light of the street lamps. His heart raced. There was no way they could escape if they tried to run. The figures were too close. They would be seen. He looked at Zara, who was still standing by the crate, her eyes wide with fear. She had no idea what was going on. "Stay down," Ethan whispered, crouching beside her. He grabbed the makeshift knife they had found earlier and held it in his hand, trying to calm his nerves. This wasn't what he wanted. He didn't want to fight, but he couldn't let anyone take her, not without a fight. The footsteps grew louder as the figures moved closer. Ethan's mind raced. He had to think fast. He had to make a decision. Without a word, he grabbed Zora's hand and pulled her toward the back of the warehouse, where a set of old, rusted stairs led up to a loft. It wasn't ideal, but it was higher ground, and that would give them an advantage. Zora didn't question him. She followed him, her tiny hand clutching his tightly. They made it up the stairs without a sound, and Ethan held his breath, waiting. The figures outside were getting closer now. He could hear them talking, but he couldn't make out the words. They were coming inside. He needed to buy them some time. Zora looked up at him, her silver eyes reflecting the dim light from the warehouse. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't know. He didn't know what they were up against or who those people were. All he knew was that he had to protect her, and if it came down to it, he would do whatever it took. He glanced around the loft, trying to find something, anything, that could help. There was a long piece of metal piping lying on the floor, and a few crates stacked against the wall. He quickly made a plan in his mind, then turned to Zora. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and firm. "Don't make a sound." Zora nodded, her face pale but determined. Ethan took the metal pipe and quietly moved to the edge of the loft. The figures had entered the warehouse now, their footsteps echoing through the dark space below. He could see their shadows moving across the floor. They weren't going to just stand there. They were searching for something, or someone. Ethan gripped the pipe tightly, ready for whatever was coming. Ethan's grip tightened on the metal pipe as the sound of footsteps below grew louder. His heart was pounding in his chest, each thud echoing in his ears. He tried to steady his breathing, keeping as still as possible. Zora was huddled in the corner of the loft, her small form barely visible in the shadows. She had listened to his instructions and remained silent, but Ethan could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had settled in his own chest. The figures down below were close now. Ethan could hear their voices, low and cautious, but with an edge that made his skin crawl. They were searching for something, someone. He couldn't let them find Zora. He had promised to protect her, and he would keep that promise, no matter the cost. He slowly crouched, his knees barely making a sound as he lowered himself closer to the edge of the loft. From this vantage point, he could see the two figures moving beneath him. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by hoods, but their movements were deliberate, calculated. They were professional. Whoever they were, they knew what they were doing. Ethan's mind raced. They had been looking for Zora for days, and now, it seemed, they had found her. He didn't know who these people were, but he had no intention of finding out. He needed to act before it was too late. The figures moved closer, stopping just a few feet from the base of the stairs. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He needed to make a decision, and fast. He glanced over at Zora. She was watching him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and trust. It hit him again. How much she depended on him, how much he had come to care for her in such a short amount of time. She was just a child, an innocent girl caught in the middle of something far bigger than either of them could understand. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. The responsibility, the fear, the uncertainty. But one thing was clear, he couldn't let anyone take her. Not now. Not ever. Ethan took a deep breath and silently rose to his feet. He moved quietly to the far corner of the loft, where a thick piece of rope lay tangled in a corner. He grabbed it and quickly tied one end to a metal beam overhead, securing it tightly. His plan wasn't much, but it was the only one he had. He turned to Zora, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay here. I'll be back. Just don't make a sound, okay?" Zora nodded, her expression grim. Ethan's heart clenched. He didn't know if this would work, but he had no choice. He had to try. He crept to the edge of the loft, carefully peering over. The two figures were still below, scanning the room, moving closer to the stairs. Ethan knew they wouldn't be satisfied with just a quick search. They would look everywhere. He had to buy them time. Without warning, he dropped the rope down into the space below. The heavy end landed with a soft thud. The figures froze, their attention snapping to the sound. Ethan's heart raced, but he didn't hesitate. He quickly scrambled to the other side of the loft and waited. The figures stepped toward the rope, their movements slow and cautious. One of them reached out and grabbed it, tugging at it slightly. "What's this?" the first figure muttered, clearly unsure. Ethan held his breath, praying they wouldn't realize it was a trap. His plan was simple. He'd created a distraction, and as soon as they focused on the rope, he would move in. The second figure began pulling at the rope, trying to untangle it. Ethan could hear them speaking in low voices, but he couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He knew they were distracted. Now was his chance. He took a deep breath, adjusted the metal pipe in his hand, and moved. His steps were quick and silent as he slid down the wooden stairs, his feet barely touching the steps. He had to reach them before they realized what was happening. The first figure glanced up, just as Ethan reached the bottom of the stairs. Their eyes locked for a split second. There was no time to hesitate. Ethan swung the pipe with all his strength, aiming for the figure's side. The impact was sharp and the figure stumbled back, grunting in pain. The second figure immediately spun around, reaching for something, likely a weapon. Ethan didn't give them the chance to react. He rushed forward, striking again with the pipe. The second figure went down in an instant, crumpling to the floor with a muffled thud. Ethan stood over them, panting, his heart racing. He hadn't wanted to hurt anyone, but they had left him no choice. They had come for Zora, and he couldn't let that happen. The first figure groaned and tried to push himself up, but Ethan quickly moved behind him, grabbing the edge of a nearby crate and slamming it down on the figure's back. The force knocked the wind out of him and the figure collapsed, unconscious. Ethan stood there for a moment, his breathing heavy. The warehouse was silent once more. He didn't know how long he had, but he knew he couldn't waste any more time. The people searching for them would be back, and they wouldn't stop until they found Zora. He quickly checked the two figures. Both were still breathing, but unconscious. They wouldn't be a problem for a while, but Ethan knew they had to move fast. He turned and rushed back up the stairs to the loft. "Zora," he called softly, his voice tense. "We have to go, now." Zora stood up, her eyes wide, but she didn't ask any questions. She grabbed her things and followed Ethan down the stairs, staying close behind him. They had to move quickly but quietly. Ethan led the way, careful not to make any noise. He had no idea where they would go next, but he knew they couldn't stay here. They made their way through the back exit of the warehouse, stepping into the cold night air. The street outside was dark, empty. There was no sign of anyone else, but Ethan knew better than to trust the silence. The people looking for Zora could be anywhere. "Where do we go now?" Zora asked quietly, her small voice breaking the silence. Ethan didn't have an answer. He looked around, trying to figure out their next move. The city was too dangerous now. They couldn't stay here, but he didn't know where else to go. They needed to get out of sight, somewhere no one would find them. "We'll figure it out," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words. Zora seemed to sense his uncertainty. She looked up at him with her silver eyes, the trust in her gaze unshakable. "You'll protect me, right?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan paused, his heart aching at the weight of her words. "I will," he promised, his voice firm. "I'll protect you no matter what." Zora smiled, a small, grateful smile, and for a moment the world felt like it was just the two of them. But Ethan knew that wouldn't last. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. As they walked into the night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Somewhere out there in the darkness, someone was waiting, watching, and they wouldn't stop until they found Zora. But for now, at least, they were free. The night felt endless. The cold air bit at Ethan's skin as they walked through the city's empty streets. The neon lights of distant billboards flickered above them, casting an eerie glow over the crumbling buildings. They hadn't spoken much since they left the warehouse. The silence between them was heavy, filled with an unspoken understanding that danger was still out there, lurking in the shadows. Ethan could feel his heart racing, every footstep echoing in the empty streets. Zora walked beside him, her small hand clutching his tightly. She was so quiet, but Ethan knew she was just as scared as he was. Even though she didn't say anything, he could see the worry in her eyes, the same fear that had taken root in his chest. "Where are we going?" Zora's voice broke the silence, soft but full of curiosity. Her words seemed out of place, like they didn't belong in this dark world they were now living in. But she was just a child. She had no idea what they were up against. "I don't know," Ethan replied, his voice grim. "I'm not sure where we'll go, but we can't stay here. It's not safe." Zora didn't respond. She simply nodded, her silver eyes fixed on the road ahead. Ethan could feel the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had promised to protect her, but he was starting to wonder if he could really keep that promise. Every time he thought they were getting away, something seemed to pull them back into danger. They walked for what felt like hours, avoiding the main streets, sticking to the darker alleys where they wouldn't be seen. Ethan's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. They couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they would be found. At least that's what he kept telling himself. The truth was, he didn't know what else to do. Finally, they reached the outskirts of the city, a place where the buildings grew sparser and the streets grew quieter. Ethan stopped, looking around, trying to make sense of their situation. The city had always felt like a cage, a place that trapped him and kept him from escaping. But now it felt even worse. Every corner was a potential threat, every person a possible enemy. This place. "It doesn't feel right," Zora whispered, pulling at his sleeve. Ethan turned to her, trying to offer a reassuring smile, though it felt more like a grimace. "I know, but we have to keep going. We'll find somewhere safe, I promise." Zora nodded but didn't look convinced. Ethan felt the same way. Every instinct in him screamed that they couldn't stop yet. But where else could they go? Who could they trust? As they continued to walk, Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. His heart stopped and he quickly turned to look over his shoulder. In the distance, he could see two figures emerging from the shadows. They moved quickly, purposefully, and Ethan's stomach sank. He knew who they were, the people who had been searching for Zora. The same ones who had followed them from the warehouse. They were getting closer. Ethan's mind raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The city was full of dead ends and he couldn't outrun them. He glanced around desperately, trying to find some kind of escape, but the streets were empty. The figures were closing in, their footsteps growing louder. He turned to Zora, who was already looking up at him with wide eyes. She could sense the danger too. There was fear in her gaze, but also something else, something stronger, determination. "I won't let them take you," Ethan said, his voice low but full of resolve. Zora didn't speak, but she nodded as if she understood. She was ready. They both were. As the figures got closer, Ethan made a split-second decision. He grabbed Zora's hand and pulled her toward a nearby alley, hoping the shadows would give them cover. They moved quickly, their footsteps barely making a sound on the damp pavement. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He had to keep moving, keep them both safe. They reached the alley, but the figures were still behind them. Ethan glanced over his shoulder and saw that one of them had started running. They were getting closer, and there was no way they could outrun them. "Zora," he said, turning to her, "stay close to me." Zora nodded, gripping his hand tightly as they continued to run through the alley. The shadows were growing longer as the night deepened, but there was no time to stop, no time to rest. They couldn't afford to make a sound. Every second counted. As they reached the end of the alley, Ethan spotted a small door in the side of a building. It was barely visible, tucked away in the corner, but it was their only chance. Without hesitation, he yanked the door open and pulled Zara inside. The room they entered was dark, dusty, and filled with old crates. It looked like an abandoned storage area. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps as he closed the door behind them, his heart still racing. He held his breath, listening for the sound of footsteps, but everything was silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing. Zora looked up at him, her silver eyes filled with concern. "Are we safe?" Ethan didn't know how to answer that. He didn't know if they were safe, but he couldn't let her see his fear. Not now, not when she needed him the most. "We're safe for now," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But we have to keep moving. We can't stay here for long." Zora nodded, but she didn't speak. Instead, she looked around the room, her gaze scanning the crates and the old wooden shelves that lined the walls. Her eyes lingered on a small object in the corner, half hidden beneath a pile of boxes. Ethan followed her gaze. There was something about the way Zora was looking at it that made him pause. It wasn't like she was just curious. It was as if she recognized it. He stepped toward the pile of boxes and began to move them aside, revealing a small metal box. It looked old, rusted, but somehow familiar. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to figure out what it was. Zora reached out and gently touched the box, her fingers brushing over the surface. "It's mine," she said softly. "It's something my mom gave me before we left." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This box was important. He could feel it in the air. Zora's mother had given it to her for a reason. Without thinking, he opened the box. Inside, there was a small, glowing crystal. It pulsed with a soft blue light, almost as if it were alive. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stared at it. Zora's face lit up with recognition. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what I've been trying to remember." Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. What was this crystal, and why had Zora's mother given it to her? Before he could ask more questions, the sound of footsteps echoed from outside the door. They were getting closer. "We need to leave," Ethan said urgently, grabbing Zora's hand. He didn't know what the crystal was, but he knew they couldn't risk being caught with it. Zora didn't protest. She nodded and held the crystal close to her chest as they moved to the back of the room, where a small window overlooked a narrow alley. Ethan glanced out the window. The figures were closing in. They didn't have much time. "We're going to make it," he said, his voice low but determined. Zora looked up at him, her silver eyes reflecting the moonlight. "We're not alone, right?" she asked, her voice soft but full of trust. Ethan smiled, though it was tinged with uncertainty. "We'll always have each other." With that, he helped Zora through the window and climbed out after her. The night was still dark, but this time it felt like they were in control. For the first time in days, they had a chance. They weren't alone anymore. And they weren't going to let anything tear them apart.